This is where the stars of Kansas come to shine and tell us what makes them twinkle. This week, we welcome a man who has popped over the pond to start a new life in the Sunflower State by way of Kentucky. He's on a mission to help young people find their callings by following their passions. His name, Dr. Andrew Hippisley. He's the new Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Wichita State. Dr. Hippisley's academic resume is long and impressive, but make no mistake, this is no stuffy bookworm. He says education should be exciting, should stir students' passion and set them on a course for both career and personal satisfaction. Hippisley was born in the United States but was raised in Scotland and educated in England. His love for words and communication led him to achieve a PhD in linguistics, specializing in Russian. But Hippisley's uplifting, straightforward philosophy is translatable to any language and culture. Now he's chosen to become a Kansan and help students here realize that learning, loving, and living all go together and are in fact but a single pursuit. This is a timely message that could benefit us all. So now, let's hear all about it. Pour yourself a cold one, kick your shoes off, and get comfortable. It's time to go one-on-one with Dr. Andrew Hippisley right now. Hello and thanks for joining us. I'm Victor Hogstrom. It's a joy to welcome Dean Andrew Hippisley to the program. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here, Victor.
My first question is, how did you come to be born in the United States and raised in the United Kingdom?
Oh, that's a good story. So, even more interesting is that my parents met in Russia, where they got married.
Oh boy.
One being a New Yorker, one being a Londoner, and they decided, who shall we go and stay with? My mum or your mum? And they went to New York to stay with my mother's mother and had all of us 6 children there. And then when I was about 6 years old, my father decided it's time to go, and we went back to Great Britain. He got a job at St. Andrews University, and that's where I was raised. And interestingly enough, if you're from St. Andrews, you tend to want to go to a bigger place. And I went to London University, and that's how I ended up in England.
Interesting story. Now, I said in my introduction of you, I said that learning, loving, and living all go together and are in fact but a single pursuit.
Yes, I would agree with that. And I think fundamentally is the learning part. We never stop learning. That's how human beings were created, how we're different from other animals. We never stop adapting, we never stop learning. And to me, that's what makes higher education so important, because it cultivates that love of learning.
You grew up partially in New York. How was it then, compare and contrast, growing up in Mayo, Scotland?
It was a shock. I remember having to wear a school uniform. I remember using a wooden desk with an inkwell in it. And I remember my mother saying, we have come to a third world country. I remember all those things. But my mother is still there. She never left. She loves the country. I will always love Scotland. I'm going back in May to see the family. So very different perspectives, and maybe it gave me an appreciation for the value of having different perspectives.
So you graduated from college in England. You attended all of your education, but interestingly, you developed a love for language.
Yes, I did, and I think all linguists people into language have their own sort of language story. I was at school in Scotland where we did Latin, because you would do that in those days. And while everybody found it tedious, I loved all the tables and the paradigms and the verbs and irregularities. And I think that gave me a real sense of loving how there are different systems apart from the English system. So at school, I did many languages, Latin, Greek, French, and German. And when I went to university, I did yet another one, Russian, which is my favorite language.
So when you had career day in the 6th grade, did you tell your classmates that you were going to become a linguist?
No, I think I probably wanted to be a diplomat or an ambassador or something exciting like that. But of course, that would involve languages.
So tell us about the pursuit of linguistics. How did you go about it?
Well, I did a language which was very different from English. So it forced me to see language as not just a communication system, but as a different system of thought. And after graduating with a master's in Russian from University of London, I was very lucky to have a research fellowship with a very famous linguist called Greville Corbett at the University of Surrey, where he wanted 2 young researchers to help him do a computational model of the Russian language.
And what is that?
That is figuring out how you can think about language and then express it in such a way that a computer can verify your thoughts.
Wow.
So in other words, compiling it using a computer language. Luckily, I had done a little bit of computer programming at the University of London, but I learned a whole lot more. And from that position, I actually ended up in a computer science department.
Now, how did you go about selecting Russia as the language that really appealed to you?
Well, as I said to you earlier, my parents met in Russia. In fact, we all have Russian names.
But you were not born there.
I was not born there, but my father and my mother used to talk to each other in Russian.
Oh.
It was a very romantic thing that they did. And when we were very young, they gave us Russian names. My middle name is Rurik, for example, who's the first prince of Kievan Rus. And they would talk to each other in Russian, and they would try and teach us some Russian as well. So, of course, and my father did Russian, so of course I found Russian amazing because it's what my father did.
And here everybody thinks it's French is the romantic language.
Well, maybe they don't know enough Russian then.
So why did you end up teaching in the United States instead of in Moscow? What is the story coming back to the U.S.?
Coming back to the U.S. Well, being an American citizen, I always had the option. And after a few years of being married, and we had our 3 children, my wife and I had the serious conversation, shall we ever try an adventure together? And she's all up for adventures. She was actually brought up in Nigeria.
Like your mom and dad in Russia.
It was like a repetition. And she and I said, let's go for it. So we went to the University of Kentucky, a one-way ticket from Gatwick to Cincinnati. She had never been to the States before, and that's where we settled, and we were there for 11 years.
So you are now the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at WSU. And you said, and I quote, "Liberal arts education provides a variety of tools to draw from in the workforce." Elaborate on that.
Well, when you learn Russian, when you do history, when you do philosophy, when you do a science, on the way to solving problems, you're learning all sorts of things about how to address a problem. One of the big things you're doing is you're learning how to make a decision. Which methodology should I use? How do I arrive from point A to point B? I think one of the most important aspects or skills in the workforce is decision making. You have a lot of data, you have a lot of complexity, and yet drawing from all of those data and those complexities, you have to ultimately make a decision. You learn from the liberal arts that there is never a right decision. There is just a less wrong decision. So you appreciate how to do the optimal thing. Maybe not the perfect thing, but at least the optimal thing. And that to me is one of the most...
And that's because it's not an exact science.
Is because when it's human life, there's nothing particularly exact about it.
Right.
I think the mathematicians like to say that life mathematics is always non-linear or chaotic mathematics.
So how do you, but before I go to that question, what about outside of the workforce? How does it help liberal arts?
Well, that's what I think, and I think it's extremely important to address that question, because we will all stop working at some point, we will retire, and even when we work, we have many hours of leisure. To me, the liberal arts and sciences allows you to have taste, to have a variety of pleasures. I belong to Rotary, as do you, Victor. And what's interesting is if you talk to the CEOs of those businesses, they love to talk about things like history, because it's as if they have discovered the value of something like history, even though most of their life has been in business. So I think with liberal arts and sciences, it reaches to the very humanity of us. And in the end, when all is said and done, what we are left with is our humanity.
You know, parents sometimes wonder, why should I pay tuition for you to major history or to major some liberal arts course? What say you to that?
I would say that that's an extremely good question. Parents usually foot the bill. I'm a parent myself with a child in college. And my answer to that is, you want your child to do what they are passionate about. They may not know what they are passionate about yet. Let them have an open mind. Let them go to university, picking and choosing and working out what resonates best with them. If it is history, don't panic, because there is a way in which you can do what you love, let's say that's history, and also at the same time, through a minor or a certificate or a collection of courses, do what you ought to be doing. Let's say that's accountancy or economics or computer science or programming languages, which is what I did. So I would like to say it's not either or, it can be both. And a place like Wichita State University does offer both. It has liberal arts and sciences, but it also has engineering and business and health professions.
How do you go about, Dr. Hippisley, putting your message into action? How do you communicate this need for understanding the value of liberal arts to others so that they can really appreciate it?
Well, I think people who advocate for liberal arts probably do it too quietly. There is a sort of assurance that it's valuable. We all know how much it changed our lives, but that can actually restrict us from getting the message out. So I would say doing things like I did a few months ago, putting on a town hall, inviting the public, having a panel to explain the value of the liberal arts in the workforce. When I did that panel at WSU, one thing that really struck me, for example, was we had a very famous Wichita doctor on the panel, and she was talking about the humanity side of her profession, how important it is to communicate with others and empathize and understand what it is they need. So trying to get those messages across, trying to have advocates for us who have had successful careers, but in the end they always reach back into their past and remember that one course they did, the music appreciation course they did, the history course they did, the discussion about philosophy that really changed who they are.
You've talked about positive risk-taking. What is that?
Well, this is a very interesting value that Wichita State has. And when I have the privilege of speaking to new students who are coming in during orientation, I always emphasize positive risk-taking. One thing you can do is you can play it safe. You can stay in your comfort zone. You can think, this is what I like, this is what defines me. You don't grow. If, on the other hand, you challenge yourself, if you do not think you are a leader and you challenge yourself by taking up a leadership position, if you don't think you're very good at speaking and you challenge yourself to take a course where you know in the 16th week you're going to have to stand up in front of the whole class and give a speech, If you think that you're weak in math and you take a course where you know there's going to be some statistics, that's you taking a risk, a positive risk, because you could find out who you really are. I'll give you an example of myself. I was very happy with Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Pushkin. That was my world, literature, Russian literature. Mm-hmm. And my professor said to me, why don't you try computer programming? Terrifying thought. And I did it. And I realized that language, natural language like Russian, and artificial language like computer programming, they're not that very much different from each other. And I found something within myself I never knew I had. I took a risk.
Your risk paid off, but some risks don't.
It's true, and that's why I would say even more the reason to take risks at university. You have 4 years of a kind of world outside of a world, where you can take a risk, you can try different subjects, you can try rowing because it's there, get cold.
Right.
But what are the consequences? The consequences are that you are within a group of people who are your allies, your friends, your protectors. It's okay to take a risk. But what it will do is it will prepare you to be a risk taker in the real world. And I think one of the things we have to do at 4-year institutions is train our students to become habitual risk takers. And by the way, that is why I love the game of baseball, because a guy gets up there and he just swings. He may be caught out, he may be struck out, but he gives it all he can. And then what happens? He strikes out and he comes back and tries again.
So is college for everyone?
I don't think college is for everyone. I will say right now, I will say that Wichita is a city which has very strong aviation and lubrication and all these different industries, and it is perfectly feasible to go from high school into a well-paid job and do well in that job. However, I do think that if you do have that calling to have a deeper level of education, to be exposed to liberal arts, to be exposed to other ways of thinking about things, then you should go for it, because what it will do is it will give you far more options. It will create a level of adaptability where you can move from one career to another if you so choose.
Now, you have been successful. You took a good risk, and you're now Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and you could get other jobs because you are a linguist. But what has been the most defining moment of your life?
The most defining moment of my life, I would say meeting my wife. She's the one who tells me to keep on going, to persist, to take risks. I'm a risk taker, but a lot of it's to do with her. Take risks. And I think having a relationship, a partnership where you're willing to listen to the other side, I think that's something that you may not always agree with, but you're willing to listen and you're willing to change and adapt. Mm-hmm. I think that's the most important thing in anybody's life.
What is the most disappointing experience that you've had in higher education?
I think the most disappointing experience I have had and I am having is to see the humanities being in such a defensive and vulnerable position. Mm-hmm. Students and advocates for higher education tend to think that they're beginning to tend to think that the real value of higher education is to get pre-professional degrees to the cost of humanities. And having realized myself how much value my life has been added to by doing a humanities degree, it's a huge regret that I'm seeing right now. And that's why I really, as Dean of Arts and Sciences, I feel my job is to advocate as strongly as possible for humanities and social sciences.
What about the most exciting moment you've had as a professor and as dean?
The most exciting moment I have, in fact, these are moments that I have regularly. This is when I interview new hires for my college.
Okay.
Because my college has physicists who work on things like neutrinos. I didn't know what they were until I came to Wichita.
Neutrinos.
Neutrinos, they're little subatomic particles that happen when certain reactions take place. I'm learning about this all the time. But I'll have interview physicists, I'll interview nonlinear mathematicians, I'll interview psychologists, and I say to them, be gentle with me, just tell me, what is it you do? And by the way, every experience I have, they have been very, very gentle, and what I have learned from other people's research that has nothing to do with my own has been incredible.
Now, before you came back to the United States, well, not before, but when you came back to the United States, you went to Kentucky. What did you do there before becoming dean here in Wichita?
I went to the University of Kentucky. They had a linguistics program within the Department of English. I became director of that program, and then subsequently we created a Department of Linguistics, which is, I hear, thriving right now, even without me. And I was the inaugural chair of that department. And my job there was to advocate for the linguists. And again, not the most popular subject. So I tend to sort of take on these cases where they're either marginalized or threatened, and my job is to raise them. Right. And I very much enjoyed doing that.
Well, let's go a little light right now. Play a little game. I'll give you a Scottish choice.
Oh.
And an American choice, and you tell me which you prefer.
Oh.
All right, so we begin. These are pictures, a picture game.
All right. Oh, I have to say, I prefer the old man with the bagpipes. I can just hear it right now.
And not the...
no contest.
Not the electric guitar.
I love the electric guitar, but no, the bagpipes
it just
does something to me.
Brings back memories?
Yes.
Okay. Here's the next one.
You know, I am sorry to be Scottish again, but I will say, I having been brought up in St Andrews, which is the home of golf, I think it would be a travesty if I didn't say I prefer the golf picture.
Okay. Well, makes sense. And we have
now, is that whiskey, bourbon or Scotch?
Scotch whiskey and Budweiser.
Well, again, this is. I hope there's another picture, because I will say I will have to go for the malt, as long as it's a single Scotch.
Okay. And the final one.
Haggis or a hot dog.
Right.
You really have to be in the mood for a haggis. And usually it's on Robbie Burns' night, which is once a year, and that's when it's bearable. Whereas a hot dog can happen anytime, so I will take the hot dog.
You take the hot dog. All right. That ends the little game. Interesting. Let's talk about you some more personally, and tell us about your family.
Sure.
Your children. I know we have something in common. You have twins, and I have twins.
We both have sets of twins,
a
brace of twins.
Right. Yes.
I have two twin boys, 15 years old. One's called John, he's the older one, and one is called Max. They both go to Andover High School, and one is into baseball, one is into track, and both are absolutely, I think, thriving in Wichita. For them, the move was difficult, but they're doing extremely well. Then we have our firstborn, Natalia. She is at University of Kentucky, and she's doing a degree in education, and she's a sophomore there. And then, of course, I have my wife, who I mentioned before, Rachel.
What misconceptions do Kansans seem to have of Britain that you've discovered?
Oh, that we're very, very clever.
Oh, is that right?
We're not all that clever, and not all of us are.
And what about misconceptions did you have of Kansas before you came here?
Well, I thought it was going to be a very flat, boring-looking state, and it isn't at all. I've been introduced to the prairie lands by one of my biology faculty. I've been to the Flint Hills, and I think it's absolutely beautiful. We're going to do a very long drive to Colorado Springs, and I'm looking forward to that. So the scenery is magnificent.
So as an educator, what is your greatest concern for the young generation that is just coming up of age today?
This young generation, I think, is a generation that really wants to make a difference in the world. Because sometimes we call them Generation Z, and they are exactly what you want people to be. They're always asking the question, why? Not just how can I do it, but what's the point in doing it in the first place? My worry about education is that we'll squish that, we'll damp out that flame. We'll say, no, don't worry about the why. What you need to do is just get a job and earn money. And to me, that would be the worst thing we can do. I think this generation can teach us. They can teach us as to what a real, fulfilling life could be.
So what is the meaning of life for you today?
The meaning of life to me is to find out who you are, find out what is wrong with the world, and find out what your specific, unique role is in changing the world. That's the point. And if you can do all of those things and not be an imposter and not pretend to be someone you're not, but be who you really are, then you are the most fulfilled, happy person who's able to persist and be resilient when things go bad, and when things go well, you are joyous.
Do you believe that everyone has a role in changing the world?
I believe absolutely everybody does, and I think you need to see your role, and I think that is the chief purpose of higher education, is to open your eyes to what your role is.
So how do you go about determining what your role is?
You do positive risk-taking. You take different courses. You move around. It's like going to a restaurant and trying things you've never tried before. And then by doing that and doing it well, put 100% effort into every single course you do. By doing it well, you discover what really makes you passionate.
All right. On that note, I say thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Good conversation.
Sure.
And thank you for watching this edition of One-on-One. If you have a question or comment, please email it to oneonone@kpts.org. We read every one of them. Until next time, I'm Victor Hogstrom. Take care and be well.